So what we're going to do now is we're going to use reference angles and cast rule to actually solve some trigonometric equations. So our book actually gives us some steps. Step 1 says you need to determine the quadrants the angle will be in, and we'll talk about how to do that. Second step is going to be using our calculator, and we're going to use inverse sine, inverse cos, and inverse tan. But the other thing you need to remember when you use those things is that your calculator must be in degrees. So we're going to look at how to do that. How do we put our calculator in degrees? So if you turn on your calculator and you hit mode, in mode, the third line down you're going to see is radians and degrees. So make sure that you're on degrees and you hit enter and your calculator is in degree mode, and then you can just hit second function and quit, and that'll get you out of there. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to use these steps to help us solve some equations here. So if we look at the first equation says we're dealing with sine. So I'm going to look at cast rule. And if we look at the decimal value, it's positive. So it's saying we're working in the quadrants where sine is positive. Well, everything's positive in quadrant 1, and sine's positive in quadrant 2. So the next thing says determine the reference angle, and we have to use our calculator to do that. So essentially what we do is we take this equation and we move sine to the other side. So we end up with theta is equal to sine to the -1, or inverse sine of 0.5. So we take our calculator, we go second function sine, and we type in 0.5 and we hit enter. It tells us our reference angle is 30 degrees. So that means our reference angle in quadrant 1 is 30 degrees and our reference angle in quadrant 2 is 30 degrees. And this notation here tells us we have to find all the angles in our particular 0 to 360 degrees. Well, the first angle is this angle in quadrant 1. It's 30 degrees. The second angle, we have to do our rotation all the way around to the terminal arm in quadrant 2. Well, we've gone all the way around and we're 30 degrees away from 180. So if we take 180 minus 30, tells us our second angle is 150 degrees. So let's look at a couple more examples similar to this. The next one says we're working with sine, but we're working with where sine is negative. So if we look at our cast rule, sine is positive in the first and the second quadrant, so that means sine has to be negative in the third and the fourth quadrant. So that's where we're working. So then take our calculator and you go inverse sine of negative 0.8090. It tells us it's a negative angle, but if we round this, it tells us our reference angle is 54 degrees. So that's our reference angle in quadrant 4 and our reference angle in quadrant 3. They're both 54 degrees. So how do I determine those two particular angles? Well, I have to look at this. I've gone 180 degrees plus 54 degrees more. So 180 plus 54 is going to tell me that this first angle is 234 degrees. The next one is almost 360 degrees. We're 54 degrees less than 360. So if we go 360 minus 54, that's going to tell us that our second angle is 306 degrees. Now we're going to look at a tangent example. Again, draw your coordinate axis, put in cast. Tangent is negative. The decimal's negative here. Well, tangent's positive in quadrant 1 and 3, so tangent's negative in 2 and 4. We take our calculator, we go the inverse of tangent of negative 2.4586. Tells us our reference angle to the nearest degree is 68 degrees. So this is 68 and that's 68. So to find our two angles, the one in the second quadrant and the one in the fourth quadrant, in the second quadrant we have to go 180 minus 68, which is actually going to give us 112 degrees. And in the fourth quadrant we have to go 360 minus 68, which is actually going to give us 292, I think. Let me check. 360 minus 68. Yeah, 292. So there's our two angles that give us our solution. If you look at the top of the next page, we have some special angles here. We have sine theta is 1 and cos theta is 0. They're actually called quadrantals, because what actually ends up happening, if you look at this, if you take the inverse of sine of 1, you get 90 degrees. Well, 90 degrees is this right here, that positive y-axis going upwards. So we actually only have one angle in this case. It's 90 degrees to here and it's 90 degrees to there. So there is only one answer. Sine is only 1 at 90 degrees. If you do the cosine of 0, you go second function cosine and 0, you also get 90 degrees. So if you get 90 or 180 or 270 or 360 as an answer, there's actually only one solution to those problems. The last question is just requiring us to solve an equation before we actually solve it. We have 3 tan theta plus 1 equals 4. So the first thing we're going to do is subtract 1 from each side, and we get 3 tan theta equals 3. Now this means 3 times tan theta. So we're going to divide each side by 3, and we're going to get tan theta equals 1. So now we need to look at where tangent is positive, because this is positive 1. So we're going to look at the cast rule. Tangent's positive in the first and the third quadrants, but this question says it only wants us to look at the first two quadrants, the solutions between 0 and 180 degrees. So we're only worried about the first quadrant. So we take out our calculator, we go inverse tan of 1, and we get 45 degrees. So that's our reference angle, and 45 happens to be our answer because it's the angle in quadrant 1. And there we go, solving some simple trig equations.